A waiter played the piano on stage. Everyone mocked him until Dean Martin sat down next to him. What happened next transformed a moment of humiliation into the discovery of a lifetime and proved that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. It was Friday night, March 22, 1963, at the Bamboo Room, one of Los Angeles' most exclusive nightclubs on the Sunset Strip. The kind of place where Hollywood executives made deals over martinis, where starlets hoped to be discovered, and where the city's elite came to see and be seen. The interior was all polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers, with intimate round tables surrounding a small stage where the finest jazz musicians in the city performed nightly. The clientele that evening was typical for the Bamboo Room: studio heads in expensive suits, actors between pictures, socialites whose names appeared regularly in the society pages, and tourists with enough money to buy their way into Los Angeles glamour for one evening. At table 7, near the back but with a perfect view of the stage, Dean Martin sat with 3 friends from the industry, enjoying a quiet dinner and the kind of conversation that only happened when people who understood the entertainment business could speak freely among themselves. Dean was 55 years old and at the absolute peak of his career. His records topped the charts, his movies made millions, and his television variety show was appointment viewing for families across America. But tonight, he was simply a customer, dressed casually in a dark suit and tie, content to be anonymous in the dim lighting of the club. The evening's entertainment had been exceptional. A trio featuring piano, bass, and drums had played 2 sets of sophisticated jazz that had the audience appreciating both the music and their own good taste in being there to hear it. But now it was nearly midnight, and the musicians had taken their final bows and left the stage for the evening. Tommy Ricci was 23 years old and had been working as a waiter at the Bamboo Room for 8 months. He was tall and lean, with nervous energy that he channeled into being one of the most attentive servers the club had ever employed. Tommy had grown up in a working-class Italian family in East Los Angeles, where his parents ran a small grocery store and dreamed that their son would find steady work that didn't require him to worry about where his next paycheck was coming from. What Tommy's parents didn't know, and what none of his co-workers at the Bamboo Room suspected, was that Tommy Ricci had been playing piano since he was 6 years old. His grandmother had been a church organist, and she taught him to read music and play classical pieces on an old upright piano that dominated the living room of her small apartment. Tommy had continued playing through high school, had even been accepted to a music program at USC, but his family's financial situation had made college impossible. So Tommy waited tables at night and dreamed of music during the day, practicing on a beat-up keyboard in his tiny studio apartment and occasionally sitting in with amateur bands that played in coffee shops and small venues around the city. This particular Friday night, something unusual was happening at the Bamboo Room. The club's owner, Vincent Morrison, was celebrating his 10th anniversary of owning the establishment, and he'd decided to make it an open mic evening. After the professional musicians finished their sets, he announced that any employee who wanted to perform would be welcome to take the stage. It was meant as a gesture of generosity, a way of acknowledging the staff who made the club's success possible. But as Morrison made his announcement to the well-dressed crowd, it was clear that most of the customers saw it as entertainment of a different sort, the amusing spectacle of watching working-class employees embarrass themselves in front of their betters. 2 waitresses had already taken their turns, singing popular songs with enthusiasm that exceeded their technical ability. The audience had been politely appreciative, applauding just enough to avoid seeming cruel while clearly enjoying the novelty of the situation. Tommy had been watching from the back of the room, torn between his desire to play and his fear of humiliating himself in front of an audience that he knew would judge him harshly. But as Morrison called for any other employees who wanted to perform, Tommy found himself walking toward the stage before his conscious mind had decided to do so. The piano bench was positioned at the club's baby grand Steinway, an instrument that Tommy had been admiring from a distance for 8 months but had never had the opportunity to touch. As he sat down and adjusted the bench height, he could hear whispered conversations from the audience that made his nervousness spike dramatically. "Oh, this should be interesting," someone said with barely concealed amusement. "I hope he knows chopsticks," came another voice, followed by quiet laughter. Dean Martin, sitting at table 7, watched the young waiter with interest rather than amusement. There was something in Tommy's posture at the piano, something in the way he positioned his hands over the keys that suggested more familiarity with the instrument than the audience was expecting. Tommy began to play, and immediately it was clear that something was wrong. Not with his playing, which was technically proficient and musically sensitive, but with his confidence. The whispered comments from the audience had rattled him, and what should have been a smooth, confident performance of "The Way You Look Tonight" was instead tentative and apologetic. He was playing the right notes, but he was playing them like someone who expected to be interrupted at any moment. His touch was light where it should have been assured, his phrasing careful where it should have been expressive. It was the musical equivalent of someone trying not to take up too much space. The audience began to respond exactly as Tommy had feared. Conversations resumed at several tables, the kind of dismissive background chatter that suggested the entertainment was no longer worth their attention. Someone laughed at a mistake that wasn't actually a mistake, but sounded like one because Tommy had second-guessed himself. "Maybe he should stick to taking orders," came a comment from a table of studio executives that was loud enough for Tommy to hear. Dean Martin set down his coffee cup and stood up from table 7. His movement was casual, unhurried, the same easy motion he used for everything, but his 3 dinner companions recognized the expression on his face. Dean had made a decision about something, and when Dean made decisions, they tended to be implemented immediately. "Dean, where are you going?" asked one of his friends, a television producer named Harry Cohn. "Kid needs some help," Dean replied simply, and walked toward the stage. The audience didn't immediately notice Dean's approach because their attention had largely drifted away from Tommy's performance. But as Dean stepped onto the small stage and sat down on the piano bench beside Tommy, conversations began to stop one by one until the entire club was focused on the unexpected development. Tommy's hands froze over the keys as he realized who had just joined him. He'd served Dean Martin dinner 3 hours earlier, had been professional and efficient and completely starstruck, and now Dean Martin was sitting next to him at the piano. "Don't stop playing, son," Dean said quietly, his voice carrying the same warmth that had made millions of people feel like his personal friend. "You're doing fine, just maybe a little scared." Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. "Tell you what," Dean continued, his hands finding the upper register of the piano keyboard. "Let's try this together. You keep doing what you were doing, but maybe with a little more confidence. And I'll fill in some harmony, make it a conversation instead of a solo." Dean began to play, his right hand finding melodic lines that supported and enhanced what Tommy had been attempting. But more importantly, Dean's presence and his obvious respect for Tommy's abilities gave the young waiter something he'd been missing: permission to actually perform instead of just trying to get through the song without making mistakes. Tommy's playing began to change immediately. His touch became more assured, his phrasing more expressive. He was still playing the same notes, but now he was playing them like someone who belonged at the piano, like someone who had something to say through the music. The conversation between the 2 pianos developed organically. Dean would introduce a phrase, and Tommy would respond with a variation. Tommy would establish a rhythm, and Dean would add harmonic colors that made the simple song structure sound sophisticated and fresh. But the real magic happened when they began to sing. Dean started with the first verse of "The Way You Look Tonight," his voice carrying its characteristic warmth and intimacy. But instead of treating it as a solo performance, he left space for Tommy to join in, encouraging him with nods and smiles that made it clear this was meant to be a duet. Tommy's singing voice was different from his piano playing, more naturally confident, less affected by nervousness. It was a warm tenor that blended beautifully with Dean's baritone, and when they reached the chorus and began harmonizing, the combination was genuinely magical. The audience was completely silent now, but it was the attentive silence of people who recognized that they were witnessing something special, rather than the dismissive silence of people waiting for entertainment to end. For 4 minutes, the Bamboo Room was transformed. The elegant nightclub became an intimate concert hall, the wealthy clientele became an audience rather than judges, and Tommy Ricci became a musician rather than a waiter who happened to play piano. When the song ended, the applause was immediate and genuine. Not the polite acknowledgement that had followed the earlier amateur performances, but the enthusiastic response that professional musicians earned when they delivered something memorable. Dean stood up from the piano bench and put his hand on Tommy's shoulder, a gesture that was both congratulatory and protective. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said to the audience, his voice carrying easily through the club's sound system, "I think you just heard something pretty special. This young man has real talent, and I wanted to make sure you all got a chance to appreciate it properly." The applause intensified, and Tommy felt something shift in how the audience was looking at him. 15 minutes earlier, he'd been the help providing amusement. Now he was being acknowledged as an artist. Dean turned back to Tommy and spoke quietly, so that only the young waiter could hear him. "You've got the goods, son. Real musical instincts, good technical skills, and the kind of natural feel that can't be taught. You've been thinking about doing this professionally?" Tommy nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by what had just happened. "I've been trying to break in, but it's hard when you're waiting tables 6 nights a week and nobody takes you seriously during the day." Dean smiled, the expression that had reassured countless people that their problems were solvable. "Well, that's about to change. You free for lunch tomorrow? I know some people who should hear you play." 6 months later, Tommy Ricci was the house pianist at one of the most prestigious jazz clubs in Beverly Hills, recommended by Dean Martin and sponsored by several industry professionals who had been at the Bamboo Room that Friday night. But the real transformation had happened in those 4 minutes when Dean Martin had sat down beside him and shown him that he deserved to be taken seriously as a musician. Not through charity or pity, but through genuine artistic collaboration that demonstrated Tommy's abilities to an audience that had been ready to dismiss him. Years later, when Tommy had become a successful session musician and occasional performer, he would always credit that evening as the moment his career began. Not because Dean Martin had discovered him, but because Dean Martin had believed in him enough to share a stage with him as an equal. "Dean didn't make me a better musician that night," Tommy would say in interviews. "I was already a good musician. What Dean did was show me and everyone else that I had the right to be taken seriously. He gave me permission to stop apologizing for taking up space and start claiming the space I'd earned." The story became part of Los Angeles music folklore, told and retold as an example of how genuine talent could emerge from the most unexpected places, and how sometimes all it took was one person with the confidence and generosity to recognize that talent and give it the platform it deserved. If this story of mentorship, courage, and the power of believing in hidden talent inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who has ever felt dismissed or overlooked for their background rather than judged on their abilities. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you needed it most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when kindness changes everything.